Yeah, thanks a lot for introducing me, and I will go ahead and share my screen. And I hope that you're all seeing my presentation right now. And since no one says anything, I'm just going to...
We see it.
Okay, great. Yeah, so my talk today is going to be about neural architecture search applied to medical image segmentation, which fits well into this forum of automated ML. And I will give you a quick outline as to how this fits in and what. Give you a short introduction into the topic, a few basics about neural architecture search, and a few basics about genetic algorithms, which is the subfield used in neural architecture search, and is kind of important for this use case that I will be talking about afterwards, which is essentially the CVPR paper that got published by these brilliant folks from the Johns Hopkins University and NVIDIA, who developed a version of neural architecture search that was applied to 3D medical image segmentation. And that is really exciting and also very applied, and kind of shows how this neural architecture search can actually be used in practice. So first of all, everyone knows the machine learning development cycle, likely. There's different stages here, and arguably, these stages take different amounts of times. A lot of people would say that collecting data essentially takes the longest amount of time because you always have flaws in your data, and there's like certain things you have to engineer out of the data that you collected. But what we're focusing on here in this part of automated ML, essentially in neural architecture search, is this area. Basically, the model development, refinement, and this iterative process that usually also takes a long time for the ML scientist to go through. And that's part of what neural architecture search tries to automate. So we're kind of neglecting the rest of these pieces. So just a few basics for neural architecture search, and I kind of already said this maybe 2 times, but it is automating the ML development process by learning an optimal network topology for a certain task. Ideally, this would be not just applied to a certain task, this would be as generic as possible to work for multiple tasks, but let's stick with one task for now. The whole goal of this is to basically have the AI design a better architecture, a better neural network architecture than would be humanly possible or would be humanly designed. And this is obviously a huge space, and it's very, very complex, and it's not super easy to summarize, but there's 3 components that are always part of this process, and one of them is, or these 3 I've listed here, the first one would be the search space. You essentially need and connections, so essentially you need to define what type of layers you will choose for your neural network, how they're connected, what type of hyperparameters come in, and that has to be a defined search space. Because that search space, if you don't define it clearly enough, it could be gigantic and enormous, because you can take it down to the smallest hyperparameter level, and that becomes very inefficient. Then the second component of NAS is the search algorithm. Basically, the idea is here that you sample from a population of network candidate models, and you optimize for the highest performing one. And this is often based on reinforcement learning or genetic algorithms, which is why I'll give a quick intro into genetic algorithms. And then the last component, which often happens to be the most expensive part and the most compute intensive part, is the evaluation strategy, because you have to make sure that you can quantify the performance of these candidate architectures, and essentially you generate in each iteration you generate a lot of candidate models that you have to evaluate, and based on how well they perform for this task that you're trying to optimize for, you have to select the best possible architecture. I will give a quick introduction to genetic algorithms, because in this paper that I'm going to introduce, they use a genetic algorithm as their search algorithm. And is also a topic that's very different from deep learning, but it's super intuitive, so it's kind of easy to understand. It's essentially a search heuristic that is inspired by evolutionary theory. So a lot of these terms here come from that. And essentially, you need to, what people do is they have to encode their problem, their model solution, into a numerical representation. So you encode parameters as genes, and those genes are then combined into chromosomes. So essentially what that means is each feature that one network candidate model contains is encoded as one of these genes. So for example, if you have a 3-layer network with 2 pooling layers or something like that, it doesn't have to be super specific, but essentially that will be encoded in these solutions together. So one chromosome is essentially one potential network solution that builds the population that you sample from. So each of these sequences represent a candidate model in our use case. When applied to a different problem, then obviously what these chromosomes represent is different. But for our use case, we're thinking of these as a candidate model. And then the workflow, or the flow basically that these models go through, this function which evaluates how well these candidate solutions are performing, how they can be ranked. And then you perform crossover, which is basically taking 2 candidate solutions and mixing their genes so that you produce an offspring, a new model that has some of the architecture components from previous models. And then you can apply mutation, which is just a little bit of added randomness. Essentially what it does is it flips bits in here. So it flips the encoding so that you add some randomness. And then you select the best performing models. And this is a loop until you essentially reach a termination criteria. So that's just pretty high level, but it's pretty intuitive. So that's why I thought it's good to give an introduction to that. And just a quick reminder, this plugs in here essentially. The search algorithm is often based on genetic algorithms or reinforcement learning. I mentioned this before, NAS is extremely inefficient. Like it requires tons and tons of resources, because if you think about just training one deep learning model already takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of data, it takes a lot of GPUs, and then imagine training thousands of these models in each iteration and coming up with the best deep learning model, which is also trained at the end of the day. So essentially you're training 1,000 models. So this is extremely computationally inefficient, and that's why there are certain ways to deal with this. The network sides during the search stage, and basically they search across building blocks of neural networks, and they put these neural network building blocks together, and at testing time they test the entire network, which causes an inconsistency problem. The same thing with the second approach of decreasing the input size at search stage and then using the full size at test stage is also causing an inconsistency problem. And then another way to deal with the huge computational requirements is progressively increasing the network size as you build it. But that introduces an unfair advantage for portions of the network, because that essentially means that certain parts of the network will be retrained in each iteration, or will be trained more than other parts as you add on to the network in each iteration. So the main question remains for NAS in general is how to most effectively limit the search space or make this whole thing more efficient. Because it is out there, like it's, in theory, we could probably automate most model development tasks. It's just too inefficient for now. So that's where this applied use case comes in. These people from Johns Hopkins University and NVIDIA, they applied case, which is super interesting because since it's so narrow, they were actually able to pull it off without using too many resources. And the way they do it is they basically define a course-defined network. So they divide the search space into two parts. They divide it into the initial topology search and the operations search. So what that really means, I'll go into the second. So the course stage, during that stage, they basically search over a network topology and define how cells are connected, and cells being layers. So how the different layers are connected, what type of layers they're using, and essentially providing the broader architecture. And then in the define stage, which I will speak of in a second, they will then define the more fine-grained features, such as what type of operations are applied in the cells. But to stick with the core stage, it's too large. The search space is too large, so they have to come up with ways to make it more efficient. And they have two strategies. One of them is they actually assign similarity scores to networks that are similar, assuming that similar networks will achieve a similar performance. And then they basically cluster them and rank the performance of the cluster. And then they only sample from these clusters instead of treating each individual network, candidate network as its own. So then they start oversampling from the candidate network clusters that are ranked the highest, which right away raises the question of bias, because you're essentially driving your whole search into one corner pretty early on. But that's the point at this stage. We're trying to limit the search space, so there might be some loss of really fancy combinations that we never even discover, but that's essentially the point here in this stage. And then the other strategy they use, which they can only use because they're doing medical image segmentation, is they prune it to certain architecture components that are shared among most medical image segmentation models. So for anyone who doesn't know what is, basically the state-of-the-art model for any medical image segmentation model, because it can be pretty shallow, it's not super deep, and it performs well with a small amount of data, which are used for tasks, medical image tasks. And it's basically pretty simple. It takes the input, downsamples it, upsamples it again, and concatenates input from the encoder. So this part here, the front part is called the encoder. This part on the other side is called the decoder. Wait, can people actually see my pointer? Because I was pointing. Okay, now people can see. Okay, so this part is called the encoder. This part is called the decoder. And you essentially concatenate these inputs together. So it's a very basic architecture. But what they did is they know that most medical image segmentation tasks can work best with models that are unit-like. So they prune the search to take only components that are similar to this type of architecture. So that limits the search space by a lot, and that's probably only works in this very specific case, but it's kind of a smart way to go about this. And this is the fine stage, which I promised I will talk about in a second. For course stage, you can see here from the paper, this is basically workflow. You first find the model architecture. So these are all the nodes, these are all the available paths that you can choose in the course stage. And then they come up with this model architecture, which you can see it looks very, this is not the original, the actual architecture, we'll look at that later, but it will probably look a lot like a unit. And then in the fine stage, it comes to actually defining what type of operations are used per cell. And a cell, they refer to a cell as a fully convolutional module, which is the only type of module they use here. So again, it's very limited in search space. but it's sufficient for what they're doing. So what they do is they initialize weights that they already had from the course stage during training, and then they proceed to train this model now with the specific operations that they search over, and then they again evaluate. So this is the experiments they did to validate that this is actually working. Those experiments were conducted on a medical image segmentation data sets from a pretty well-known challenge. MSD is the challenge, and that data set contains 10 medical image segmentation data sets, including tumor, pancreas, prostate, and a lot of other body parts. And they trained this model. They developed everything on the prostate data set. They evaluated it in all 10 of these body parts. So the way they implemented it is they defined start and end modules. They allowed the cell to have so usually the parameters that people would do a hyperparameter search for, those were fixed. Those were not actually touched. And then they used a genetic algorithm for a candidate evaluation and for sampling. So this is what I was talking about earlier. The algorithm basically to generate new networks. That was a genetic algorithm that performs in the way that I explained earlier. And here on the side, you can see modules that they have. So they allow these modules to either take one input tensor or two and then concatenate. And these are the types of convolutions that are applied, that are possible to apply, and that are searched over essentially. So this is their final result. That is a network architecture. And as you can see, it looks very similar to a UNet model. It even has these skip connections here. There's like some variation going on with additional skip connections in these layers here, but essentially it looks very similar to UNet. And they then proceed to evaluate this model on all of the data sets. So the parts come from this data set they use it on. These are different submissions to that challenge, and these rows here are essentially their submissions. There's just a tiny difference between these two implementations. But what they're trying to get at is essentially that their model is outperforming the other ones. Oh, and what I didn't say, this is dice score. So these values here is in terms of dice score. So the higher, the better. 100 here would be the maximum value. They're outperforming this state-of-the-art UNet version. In a lot of the cases, they claim that they're outperforming it in most, but as you can see, it's kind of alternating. And the percentage or the differences in values are super small. So it's not really, in my opinion, it's not a clear winner, but and that's the point they're trying to make. So one of the main points that they're also trying to make here, and that essentially neural architecture search is trying to make, is that the models designed by this process should be superior to human designed models. And that should be in terms of parameters, in terms of compute resources used. And that can be measured essentially by the number of parameters and by the number of floating point operations. So how efficient the model actually is. And this is not a one-to-one mapping. So you can see different, saw previously, these were essentially submissions to this challenge, but these submissions were all based on the traditional medical image segmentation models that are always used, and they're all kind of UNet based. So you can see that the parameters that their model produced were actually, in most cases, lower, and also in the combination with floating point operations, they were seen to be more efficient. Although this is pretty efficient, this one here. But what they're trying to say essentially is that they're able to generate a model that is not just on par with the highest performing model, but also more efficient than, or as efficient as the highest performing model. Unfortunately, you don't have a comparison here with this highest performing model, but I assume that it's probably very similar. Yeah, and so those are basically the key takeaways that I want to give you with this. They were able to show that neural architecture search works, which people have shown before, so that's not news. But that's one of the things they were able to show, of course. So they were able to generate a model that's on par with the best performing UNet model, and they were able to tackle this challenge of having this super compute intensive task of NAS in a way that you can solve it when you're not Google. So any company that doesn't have access to tons of TPUs or GPUs could potentially solve this in that certain way. And they actually showed that they used less parameters and increased the model efficiency. On the other hand, I just need to definitely want to mention that this is only feasible because they defined a very narrow target task. So this is really just applicable to, at least the way they set up their framework, it's only applicable to medical image segmentation. Maybe some other segmentation tasks, but even that wouldn't be too sure to say that it would work on natural image segmentation tasks as well. And that kind of, again, makes the practical use a little bit questionable, because given that they had to put so much human expertise and human knowledge into designing this task, into designing the way the neural architecture search works, it's questionable whether this could generalize onto anything, or whether this actually has a good practical use. Actually, probably a little bit faster than I thought, because this is already the end of my talk. But if we have more time, I guess that leaves room for questions.
Yeah, I think Q&A session will be there at the end, Ulie. And such an amazing talk. I think people are mesmerized listening to, the neural architecture search and how it has become feasible with the help of your use case, and how AutoML can be applied in healthcare region. And I'm hoping that people are going to apply it more and more. Especially hearing about the genetic algorithm is really something interesting that I am finding. And for companies that have lower computational resources, I think this use case is going to really be really great to use and look at. And I'm sure your thesis must be great. I should really go through it. Thanks, Ulie, for your talk.